This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Andrew Peach, and in the early hours of Saturday the 19th of June, these are our main stories. Iranians have gone to the polls to elect a new president. A former Liberian rebel commander has been sentenced to 20 years in prison by a Swiss court for war crimes. Roman Catholic bishops in the US have voted to draft a new document on communion in what's seen as a rebuke to President Biden. Also in this podcast, the couple in Ukraine who tried to bring themselves closer together using handcuffs.
We used to have to discuss every movement, whether it was brushing our teeth or washing. Now we do routine things without a word.
First, Iranians went to the polls on Friday to choose a new president. The winner will replace the incumbent, Hassan Rouhani, a relative moderate who served the maximum 2 terms. Dissidents and some reformists have called for a boycott, saying the barring of several contenders has removed any genuine competition. The elections came at a time of widespread discontent among Iranians over economic hardships, as these voters in Tehran told us.
The most important expectation, like for most people, is the need to solve problems related to the economy and our living standards. Then it's tackling coronavirus and increasing vaccinations. And they're making a plan to address employment opportunities for young people.
We don't have an issue with the conduct of elections, and we don't have a problem with the country and the regime, but the state of the economy has been hard for the people of Iran. The economic problems should have ended somehow.
The hours of voting were extended many times during the day. I've been hearing more from our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette.
Voter turnout has long been viewed as a barometer of faith and legitimacy in the Islamic Republic. And traditionally, voter turnout has been very high. In the last elections, which Hassan Rouhani, the reformist president, won, giving him a second term, the turnout was around 73%. And it was widely seen as a vote by the Iranian people to continue policies to keep opening up to the world. This time, even the machinery of the Islamic Republic have been saying that the voting turnout is going to be around high 30s, around 40%. But it's so interesting in a time of social media how, ironically, so much more information, but so much more disinformation. Those who support the Islamic Republic are putting photos showing how long the lines are of people to vote. Those who are critics, if not outright opponents of the Islamic Republic, are showing empty voting stations and no queues in line. We'll have to wait and see what the formal official numbers are for the turnout.
Because extended voting in many parts of the world will mean a lot of people want to vote.
Exactly.
But certainly some people in Iran are saying, no, they're just trying to get the turnout to a reasonable, respectable level this time. Exactly.
Because it will be seen as a judgment on the legitimacy of this vote.
When there is a replacement for Hassan Rouhani, what's in the inbox? What will whoever is elected have facing them as challenges, Lee?
What we're looking for, first of all, to see if any of the 4 candidates gets more than 50% to avoid a second round runoff. So the Conservatives and hardliners who are supporting Ibrahim Raisi, the Chief Justice, are hoping he does cross over that 50% to avoid a second round. Now, I have to say, having covered many elections in the past, Iranian elections, for all the restrictions, after all, the candidates, those allowed to run, are chosen by an unelected council, a guardian's council of 12 jurists. This time, so many were disqualified, including the leading reformist candidates, that there's an overwhelming impression that the Islamic Republic, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, want to create the conditions for Ibrahim Raisi to win, and to win as convincingly as possible.
And we'll see what the outcome is, but in your judgment, who's in the ascendancy in Iran, the progressives or the conservatives?
Oh, there's no question. It's the hardliners and the conservatives. After 8 years of Hassan Rouhani, who came to power, promising to improve the economy, promising an Iran nuclear deal which would remove the sanctions, open Iran up into the world, even those who would want to support the reformist are saying, well, look at what it's brought us. Hence the low turnout, growing disillusionment, growing, deepening suffering under the weight of these sanctions.
Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette. Now, an estimated 250,000 people were killed during 2 periods of fighting in Liberia's civil wars from 1989 to 1997 and then from 1999 to 2003. Now, a court in Switzerland has sentenced a former Liberian rebel commander, Aliou Kouchner, to 20 years in prison for a series of war crimes committed in the first of those conflicts. Elise Kepler, Associate Director of the International Justice Programme at Human Rights Watch in New York, welcomed that sentence.
Murder, rape, pillage were among the charges, and he was convicted of most of the charges against him today in a landmark judgment in Switzerland. This is the first time anyone has been held to account for the charges of war crimes committed in Liberia during that brutal first civil war.
I asked our African regional editor Will Ross for more about Aliou Kouchner's role in the fighting.
He was a commander for one of the armed groups known as Ulimo that was fighting against a faction under the control of the man who went on to become the president of Liberia, Charles Taylor. And when he was in this group, Ulimo, in the 1990s, he was accused of a very long string of crimes, but the court in Switzerland found him guilty of 21 of the 25 charges, and these included rape, having recruited a 12-year-old child soldier, and ordering the killing of civilians, and looting and other inhumane and degrading acts carried out on the civilian population in Ouachita County in Liberia, and all that during the 1990s, the first of the 2 civil wars.
It's now 2021. How come the conviction has taken so long?
Well, he left Liberia and went to Switzerland, I think in 1999. Basically, this all comes back to the fact that there simply hasn't been any justice in Liberia. There's been a lot of reluctance from politicians to open up the wounds of the conflict, partly because some of the people who were warlords during the conflict are now powerful politicians in Liberia. So what has happened is an NGO and others working for justice in Liberia have looked for people who are resident in countries where the law allows this kind of prosecution, and Switzerland does allow for the prosecution of people who've carried out very serious crimes wherever they happened in the world. And Mr. Kouchner was a resident, or is a resident, in Switzerland. We're not quite clear why the trial took so many years, because he was arrested more than 6 years ago. But it is the first time that somebody has been convicted for the crimes directly related to those crimes during the Civil War. And there's a second case which is due to get underway next year in France.
And what's the reaction been in Liberia?
Well, from the people I've spoken to, they've largely welcomed the news. It is a historic moment, and they have been calling for this. Civil society groups have been calling for this. And they hope, one particular NGO that's pushing for justice, the leader of that NGO told me he hopes that it speeds up the push for there to be a court set up, a war crimes court set up in Liberia. But as I mentioned, there is a problem here where you've got politicians, some of whom took part in the war and committed far worse crimes than Mr. Kouchner, because they would have recruited many, many child soldiers, not just the one that he recruited or he was found guilty of recruiting. So there are obstacles in the way of justice that may stop the court being set up. But certainly this particular conviction has been largely welcomed and has opened the debate again about the push for justice inside Liberia.
Our Africa regional editor, Will Ross. Now, go back less than 2 years and Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was hailed around the world for his reforming zeal, making peace with Eritrea, tackling corruption and releasing political prisoners. Today, he leads a nation many say is more divided than at any point in recent history. Ethnic violence has forced more than 2 million people to flee their homes. A brutal war in northern Tigray province has left the region facing famine. And on Monday, when Ethiopia's long-delayed elections happen, 1 in 7 constituencies won't be taking part because of that instability. Our Africa correspondent Catherine Biera-Hanga has been to the town of Ataye, where more than 100 people were killed following fighting between Oromo and Amhara communities.
Row after row, the buildings along Attaya Road have been knocked down, looted or burnt. 34-year-old Jawa Mohammed, an ethnic Amhara, is back serving tea at his shop. But the small structure made out of corrugated iron has an orange tinge from the fire that raged here in April.
We were here when the shop was burning. It started somewhere down there and continued to us. We tried to put it out with water because we have tap water here, but it was out of control. As the fire spread, the metal started to get really hot and we could not do anything. We watched our business be destroyed.
Underlying tensions in Attaya over who really owns this land, Oromos or Amharas, have boiled over. It's one example of small and large battles happening along the fragmented lines of Ethiopia's mosaic of ethnic groups. It wasn't just homes and businesses that were targeted. Attaya Hospital stands as a burnt-out shell. There's glass, nails, and ash all over the floor. This was violence that essentially gutted out a whole community. Some of the town's residents have ended up here at a primary school 6 kilometers away. The latest additions to the millions of people already displaced by war and violence in this country. One of them is Fatuma Hussein. She's grieving for her 15-year-old daughter, Sophia, who was shot dead.
After everything I did for my daughter, she was just taken away, and I don't even know what happened. We only wanted to work and make a living and raise our children. We haven't done anything.
Attaya is one of dozens of constituencies that won't be voting on Monday. The election board says they will by October. But for now, this decision has left many here frustrated and feeling even more powerless, like Ahmed Hussein, an Oromo businessman.
The fact that we are not able to vote, we feel like we are not even alive. I am aggrieved that our town will not be able to take part in this opportunity that the whole country has been provided with.
For Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, holding this vote is crucial. Since coming to power in 2018 through a negotiated transition from the TPLF party, which ruled this country for 3 decades, he has never been tested at the ballot. A win would cement his leadership over the country and give him legitimacy to hold it together in the midst of so many divisions. Just 3 hours south of Attaya, in the city of Debre Berhan, the atmosphere is very different, charged by excitement over the elections. But conversations about ethnicity and the pressure from some groups for greater autonomy are also very present here. 35-year-old Jeanette Bet Gerawok is a candidate for the Prime Minister's Prosperity Party.
Our big motherland is Ethiopia, and different groups of people live inside by respecting each other. The identity of these groups should be respected with inclusivity. Therefore, we have to work for national unity.
And that report was from Catherine Birahanga in Ethiopia. The Palestinian Authority has cancelled a deal under which Israel was to give it at least 1 million coronavirus vaccines. The Palestinians said the jabs were too close to their expiry date. Here's Alan Johnston.
This deal was announced earlier in the day. Israel said it didn't need the ageing stock of jabs at the moment, so they were to be used to speed up the Palestinian vaccination program. In return, the Palestinians were to give Israel a similar number of vaccines that they're expecting the Pfizer organisation to deliver later in the year. But after the first shipment of Israeli jabs arrived, Palestinian officials said they were even nearer their expiry date than expected. They said there wasn't enough time to use them and that the deal was off.
In the UK, the latest analysis of the spread of COVID-19 in Britain suggests one Pfizer or AstraZeneca jab reduces the risk of needing hospital treatment by 3/4. Here's our science correspondent, Palab Ghosh.
This data is the latest to confirm the protective effect of vaccination against the Delta or Indian variant. It shows that although the vaccines are slightly less effective in preventing infection against Delta, as they were against the older Alpha or Kent variant, they're proving just as good at preventing serious illness. The chances of catching and being hospitalised was reduced by more than 90% among those who'd received 2 doses of the vaccine. More than half of the 73 people to die from the Delta variant have not been vaccinated.
A judge in Brussels has rejected a legal attempt by the EU to force the drugs firm AstraZeneca to provide it with 120 million doses of its COVID vaccine by the end of June. The court instead ordered the company to deliver just over 80 million doses by the end of September. AstraZeneca said the ruling acknowledged the supply difficulties it was facing. The EU insisted the decision supported its view that the firm had failed to meet its commitments. From Brussels, our Europe correspondent Nick Beake.
Unlike other heated confrontations taking place across Europe, this is a contest with no clear scoreline and in which both sides are claiming victory. The Court of First Instance of Brussels ruled that AstraZeneca would be fined if it didn't deliver 80 million doses to the EU by the end of September. But the figure is far lower and the deadline much later than what the European Commission had demanded. The manufacturer says it will reach that level by the end of this month. The Commission started legal action in April after accusing the British-Swedish company of unfairly prioritising the UK in vaccine delivery, when AstraZeneca revealed it would be sending tens of millions fewer doses to the EU than expected. Today, President Ursula von der Leyen said the ruling proved that AstraZeneca had not lived up to its contractual obligation. AstraZeneca said the court had dismissed other EU demands and decided the bloc of 27 had no priority over other countries. A large part of the frustration in Brussels had focused on the allegation that jabs made in the UK were not being exported to mainland Europe. The ruling stated that the failure to send doses from an Oxford Biomedica plant was inconsistent with making the best reasonable efforts on supply required by the contract, but it did not order AstraZeneca to use this British plant to fulfil the EU order. Vaccination rates across Europe have risen in the months since the EU initiated its case, but anger over its perceived unfair treatment has not disappeared.
Nick Beake in Brussels. Still to come.
Like millions of women around the world, I've been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I'm telling you this in the interest of transparency.
Just like the CNN presenter Christiane Amanpour, we'll talk to a number of other women who are undergoing treatment for the condition at the moment. Now to Greece. It was an elaborate and shocking story about a break-in at a family home in Athens in which 20-year-old Caroline Crouch was killed in front of her infant daughter. On Friday, Greek police revealed it was nothing more than a fabrication by her husband, a pilot, who claimed that 3 men had tied up him, his wife, threatened their infant daughter with a gun, strangled Caroline to death, and then fled with $15,000 in a case which shocked Greek people. Babis Anaktopoulos has now been officially charged with his wife Caroline's murder and the death of the family pet. His story fell apart following data collected from a smartwatch on Caroline's wrist. It was ultimately a data trail left by 21st century tech that led the police to this breakthrough. And a crime that's proved so shocking in Greece, coverage of the Euros was interrupted on Greek TV channels with a special news bulletin. My colleague Carolyn Quinn spoke to our tech reporter Zoe Kleiman and asked how the smartwatch worked in this case.
It's kind of a really simple tale, actually. Basically, the smartwatch data shows that her heart was still beating at the time at which her husband said she'd been murdered. Now, that probably wouldn't have been enough on its own, but there were a couple of other tech clues, if you like, that had been left behind. There were some memory cards that had been taken out of the home security camera, but the time at which they'd be taken out had been recorded on the cameras, and they didn't add up either with what the husband had said. And also there were signs that he had an activity tracker on his phone, which showed him moving around in his house at the time when he said he'd been tied up. So all of this together led the police to believe that he wasn't telling the truth.
It's really fascinating, isn't it, how this worked. Do you think, Zoe, this is unprecedented, or have we seen similar cases where tech and data has been used in this way as evidence?
We've certainly seen it in the US before. There was a really interesting case in 2018 where a lady called Karen Navarro was found in her home with a knife in her hand. She was dead. Her stepfather said he popped in to visit her and left after 15 minutes. But she was wearing a fitness tracker, and the data from that tracker showed that her heart rate had spiked, slowed down and eventually stopped all during the time that he was there. Now, he was charged with her murder. He was an elderly man and he died in custody before the trial. But we've certainly seen over the last few years an increasing use of this sort of data in the justice system. What is interesting is it's very hard to get these registered as medical devices. You know, even if you're using something like a top-of-the-range Apple Watch, there'll be a caveat saying this is not a replacement for a medical device. You can't use this heart rate tracker as an alternative to going to see a doctor. And yet, clearly, it's becoming reliable and accurate enough to be used in law enforcement.
Our tech reporter Zoe Kleinman. Catholic bishops in the United States have set themselves on a collision course with President Joe Biden. At their biannual conference, the bishops have overwhelmingly backed the drafting of a teaching document that will specifically address whether politicians who support abortion should be barred from communion. Harry Farley reports.
Catholic bishops' conferences are usually dry affairs. But this week, all the polarisation of American society was on display as the US bishops met online. On the surface, the issue was a technical one. Should the bishops proceed with drafting a teaching document on the Eucharist? But the subtext was clear. Should President Joe Biden, a committed Catholic, be denied the most important ritual in the Catholic faith because he supports access to abortion? It wasn't long before that implicit background became explicit, thanks to Bishop Liam Carey of Baker, Oregon.
It seems to me this is an unprecedented situation in the country. We've never had a situation like this where the executive is a Catholic president who's opposed to the teaching of the church.
The overwhelming result in favour, by 168 to 55 with 6 abstentions, is a direct rebuke from Catholic bishops to the Catholic president. It also exposes the deep divisions within the American church. The document will now be drafted by a committee on doctrine before the bishops can debate and amend its content at their next meeting in November. It will not set a national policy. Whatever the final draft says, individual bishops will still make the decisions for their diocese. But if the bishops do approve a Eucharist ban for politicians who support abortion, it could be politically damaging for a president who has made faith a very public pillar of his identity.
Harry Farley reporting. This week, the Outside Source programme has been covering one of the big conversations in the last few days, the announcement by the CNN presenter Christiane Amanpour that she has ovarian cancer. More than 3 million people have watched the video she posted on her Twitter feed, and here's some of what she said.
Like millions of women around the world, I've been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I've had successful major surgery to remove it, and I'm now undergoing several months of chemotherapy for the very best possible long-term prognosis. I'm telling you this in the interest of transparency, but in truth, really mostly as a shout out to early diagnosis.
One of the notable things about cancer of the ovaries is how often it goes undetected until it's at an advanced stage. Nuala McGovern has been speaking to a number of women about their own experiences and treatments, including the use of a drug called a PARP inhibitor. She spoke to Sanjukta Sharma, a writer in Mumbai in India, and first to Marlene Looney, who's a scientist near Philadelphia in the United States.
I've lived in the United States for most of my life. I was born in Cuba. I am a scientist by training, but I worked on the commercial side of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry for almost 3 decades. You know, I've always been a healthy person. I'm not even a sweet eater. I don't smoke. I don't drink. I exercise at least 3 times a week, and in the summer, I swim daily. And in March of 2019, during my usual hour of swimming, I couldn't even swim 2 laps. I was breathless. 3 days later, I'm diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. What? Now, I was always adamant of getting mammograms, pap smears, wellness checks. Here I am diagnosed with a cancer which I never had any warning signs.
So you went to the pool that day, or maybe it's outdoor swimming, wherever you went, and you just began feeling unwell?
I just couldn't swim more than 2 laps. I was breathless. And I said, something's wrong. And so I took myself to an urgent care facility. 2 days later, they thought it was pneumonia. 2 days later, they're like, 59-year-old female with no comorbidities. You don't smoke, you don't drink, you have cancer. And the next day, it's ovarian cancer, stage 4. Because the truth is that 75% of women who are diagnosed with this ovarian cancer, by the time they're diagnosed, they're already stage 3 or 4. The cancer is already spread from its point of origin in the reproductive system to other organ systems in the body. In my case, it was the abdomen and my right lung.
When you got the diagnosis of ovarian cancer, did you know what that meant?
Oh, my husband actually launched one of the PARP inhibitors I happen to be taking in the U.S. market for AstraZeneca in 2014. So my husband was in the oncology area for well over a decade at AstraZeneca and many more years before that. So when I heard that diagnosis, I had a pretty good inkling of what it was. And yet, quite honestly, I had the greatest inner peace inside of me. There was no anxiety, nothing but, where do we go from here?
So
what do we do?
You were like action plan straight away.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so that's a little bit of the history of what you were going through. Let me turn over to you, Sanjukta. You're hearing a little bit of what Marlene is saying there. You know, is some of that also resonating with you?
Yes, it is. It is. Even my journey sort of began rather suddenly in August of 2017. I was 43 at the time. I was on a sabbatical from my career. During the years leading up to that time, I remember being weighed down by a kind of a fatigue that I had never felt before. I was almost dragging my feet to do very normal things. And at that time, I decided I needed a break and spend time with my daughter, who was then 5 years old, and focus on myself and my health, So I met a nutritionist, I hired a yoga teacher, I started meditating, I started working out. So I lost weight, but that tired feeling never went away. So in August, I started developing some vague symptoms that mimicked a kind of a routine stomach upset, right? So I went to a gastro and he said it looked like gastritis or something, and he prescribed some medicines for a week. After a week, the symptoms seemed to have become worse. But I did have a gynecological condition called endometriosis, which is a painful inflammatory condition which many women go through. So I decided maybe I should just go see my gynecologist. She asked me to go for a CA-125 blood test, which is a marker for endometriosis as well as ovarian cancer. So I went through that and the numbers had gone through the roof, right? So it was very high, and she immediately asked me to go for a CT scan. Even there were no tumors, but there was some fluid. She suggested I go for a diagnostic laparoscopic surgery. During that surgery, it was discovered I had stage 3 ovarian cancer. That laparoscopic surgery turned into a sort of like a 9-hour long debulking surgery, which I'm sure Marlene also must have gone through. All of us go through that. And then, from there, my journey began. I went through 6 rounds of chemotherapy, another surgery, then another 3 rounds of chemotherapy, and from then on, I have been well, and like Marlene, I am also on a PARP inhibitor drug for the last 18 months. So far, I'm in remission and doing well. Grateful for that.
That's Sanjukta Sharma, who's a writer in Mumbai. Before that, Marlene Looney, a scientist near Philadelphia in the US, with my colleague Nuala McGovern. Now, we've all heard of tying the knot. One couple in Ukraine have gone a step further, and not for entirely romantic reasons. Alexander Kudlay and Victoria Pustovikova have decided to handcuff themselves to each other. They did it on Valentine's Day to see if this new physical bond would help improve their emotional relationship. 123 days later, the cuffs are off. But did it all work? Rachel Wright reports.
Victoria Pustovikova and Alexander Kudlay introduced themselves to their social media followers as the couple who handcuffed themselves together on Valentine's Day. In the footage, Victoria, who's a hairdresser, uses a hairdryer while her hand is attached to Alexander, who patiently moves his arm up and down, watching her getting ready in the mirror. The young couple, who live in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, made the move in a last-ditch attempt to end their cycle of breaking up and making up.
I decided it would be an interesting experience for me that will bring into my life new, bright emotions that I didn't experience before. I love him, so I came to a decision to do it.
The couple said after a while they got used to their close relationship.
We used to have to discuss every movement, whether it was brushing our teeth or washing. We had to give each other loads of instructions. Now we do routine things without a word.
Now, in front of Ukrainian TV cameras, the handcuffs were removed with large yellow bolt cutters. A representative from a Ukrainian record book stood by to declare that no couple had managed a similar feat. So how did they feel after 123 days of being chained together? A tearful Victoria said she didn't receive enough attention from Alexander despite being constantly together. Alexander's comment, "We're not on the same wavelength." The couple say they will auction the handcuffs and give the money to charity. Their advice for other troubled couples: don't do what we did.
Rachel Wright reporting. And that's all from us for now. There will be an updated version of Global News to download later. If you'd like to comment on this edition and the stories we decided to include, do drop us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. Our studio manager was Peter Luff. The producer was Liam McSheffrey. The editor is Karen Martin. My name's Andrew Peach. Thank you for listening. And until next time, goodbye.
This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Barlow, and in the early hours of Sunday, the 20th of June, these are our main stories. 500,000 people in Brazil are now known to have died with the coronavirus as the country struggles to contain a third wave. Iran's next president, the hardline cleric Ebrahim Raisi, has promised to fight corruption after winning an election in which most of his rivals were barred. Thousands of people in Poland have taken part in a parade against what they say is a rising tide of homophobia. Also in this podcast, the WHO declares Guinea free of Ebola, and trials start in Australia of a new type of COVID vaccine, which comes as a nasal spray.
The main benefit is when we give the vaccine via the same route that the pathogen or the virus gets in through, then hopefully the response will be more adept at actually stopping the virus getting in.
Also to come,
Lucas Singh of India coming on the outside lane, and Spence coming through.
India mourns an athletic hero, the Flying Sikh. Thousands of Brazilians have taken to the streets to protest against the government of President Jair Bolsonaro as the country passed 500,000 COVID-related deaths and endures a third wave of the pandemic. Demonstrators chanted slogans and sported banners calling for Mr. Bolsonaro to go. These protesters said Jair Bolsonaro was playing with people's lives.
We're protesting against the genocidal Bolsonaro government that didn't buy vaccines and has done nothing to take care of its people in the last year.
The feeling here is one of indignation. We can't stand it anymore. The government is worse than the virus.
Infection numbers are increasing and intensive care units are operating close to capacity in most Brazilian states. Our America's editor, Leonardo Rocha, told me more about the pressure on Mr. Bolsonaro's government.
These demonstrations that happened across Brazil were huge. Many of them very big in São Paulo, in Rio, and people with a number of demands against poverty. So there's a dissatisfaction against his government, but of course focusing on vaccines and focusing on his handling of the pandemic. And you have also to remember he's under pressure in Congress because the Senate opened an inquiry committee that has been investigating his government. And only on Friday, his current health minister and the former health minister have been placed under investigation by this committee. And the person who is in charge of the committee, the senator, said that President Bolsonaro himself might have to answer for all that has been done, all the mistakes that his government has made during this time.
And give us a sense of the impact of the government's decisions on the state of play in the country. Just how bad are things?
Well, things are really bad because now you're entering a third wave of the illness of the pandemic, and we have to. His first health minister said the worst case scenario was 180,000 deaths. That would be the worst possible scenario, and you have now 500,000. It's the second worst in the world. The United States has 600,000, but there people have been vaccinated, and the whole thing now has focused on the vaccine. In Brazil, only 11% of the population has been fully vaccinated, and what this Senate inquiry has been finding out is that the Bolsonaro government refused to buy millions of vaccines from Pfizer and from other labs when they had the opportunity to. And the accusation against him is that that was done for political motives, for political reasons, because from the beginning of the pandemic, he dismissed it and he said the economy should remain open. So when the opportunity to buy vaccines came up, he said, no, let's go with alternative medicines, chloroquine and other medicines that he was trying to encourage. President Bolsonaro denied. He said the poor would suffer the most if the economy had been closed, and that he tried to buy vaccines. But there's a mood of despair in the country because there's no vaccines, and the number of deaths is going up again. We had in the past 24 hours, we had 2,300 deaths, and it's going up with the hospitals full, operating at full capacity.
Leonardo Rocha reporting. With all the ballots counted, the results of the Iranian election have come as no surprise. The conservative cleric Ebrahim Raisi won by a landslide with 62% of the vote, but on a turnout that was an all-time low. He said his government would do its best to serve Iran's citizens, but analysts say the election process was engineered to ensure that Mr. Raisi won. So how's the news being greeted in Iran? Kian Sharifi is from BBC Monitoring.
Iran's state-run media are reporting on this as though this was an epic. In fact, that's what the supreme leader said. He used the word epic and sensational for the turnout. So this was an exercise in democracy. As far as they're concerned, this was a complete success story for Ebrahim Raisi and for the Iranian nation. The opposition are questioning the veracity of the turnout figures because polls suggested much lower numbers. They see this as a success for the widespread calls to boycott the election.
So what should we make of Mr. Raisi's election and that record low turnout? Questions I put to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette.
There is usually a high turnout in Iranian elections. I've seen many of them in the past, and they're usually enthusiastic affairs. There's usually choice and competition despite the restrictions of the Islamic system and a Guardian Council which vets all the candidates. In the past, there has been more of the sense of it being a real election. This time, it has really been clear that the Islamic authorities did not want to take any chances. They wanted a win for Ebrahim Raisi. So that is why hundreds of candidates were rejected, and he has scored a landslide.
Why, for the establishment, is Raisi so important? Why was it so important to guarantee his success?
It's a very critical time in the Islamic Republic. The Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is 82. He's not in good health. He is thinking of the future. He wants to make sure that the strongest tendency in the Islamic Republic is one that he agrees with. And he and the head of the judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi, basically think the same. Hardline clerics, some say ultra-nationalists, socially conservative at home. They understand that they have to have a relationship with the wider international community, but improving relations with the West will not be a priority, although returning to the Islamic nuclear deal will be one. It's being said now, it's still a very unpredictable process, of course, that perhaps he sees Ebrahim Raisi as a replacement when that time comes. Whatever it is, it's clear that he has great confidence in the 60-year-old hardline cleric.
Lise Doucette reporting. Thousands of people in the Polish capital Warsaw have been taking part in the region's biggest gay pride march. Last year the event was cancelled due to the pandemic, and President Andrzej Duda has complained of an LGBT ideology, describing it as more destructive than communism. This report from Adam Easton.
It was supposed to be a smaller, quieter parade this year because of the pandemic, but there was a huge crowd of people, many draped in rainbow flags, marching through Warsaw to the sound of loud pop music. The march's organisers tried, with limited success, to get people to walk in separate blocks of 150 to comply with the pandemic restrictions. A highly visible and heavy police presence secured the parade's route.
Adam Easton. To Turkey now, where the Women's Platform for Equality has held a demonstration in the capital against the country's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, which will expire on the 1st of July. The treaty is the most comprehensive international legal agreement which sets out binding obligations to EU states to prevent and combat violence against women and girls. I spoke to BBC reporter Berza Şimşek about what's been happening there.
Women and LGBT rights groups have gathered together to protest against Turkey's withdrawal from Istanbul Convention. This will come into force on 1st of July. Istanbul Convention is a Council of Europe treaty, legally binding, and it was ratified by Turkish Parliament. And actually, Turkey was the first state to sign it. It is mainly designed to protect women against all forms of violence, including LGBT people.
Why, if Turkey ratified this treaty in 2012 and signed up to its ideals and principles, is it now walking away?
As you know, Turkey is under criticism that the government has been becoming more and more conservative and authoritarian. So opponents of the convention are saying that this is against Turkey's traditional family values and it is encouraging homosexuality. So Erdogan's spokesperson has also said when they signed this convention, they were aiming to protect women, but this convention has been hijacked by a group of people attempting to normalize homosexuality.
What's been the reaction to this, both within the women's groups, but then also within LGBT plus groups as well?
They are saying that women are more in danger because Turkey has withdrawn from this convention, and they say they are seeing the signs of this already. In the first 5 months of this year, 171 women have been killed, according to a women's rights group called We Will Stop Femicide. And last year, 300 women have been killed. So they are saying, and including some conservative women, that now there is an understanding among the society that if you kill a woman, if you harm her or an LGBT person, you won't be punished.
Berza Şimşek. The death now of the Indian legend, the sprinter Milkha Singh, who's contracted coronavirus last month and has died aged 91 of complications from the disease. Known as the Flying Sikh, Milkha Singh won 4 golds at the Asian Games, a Commonwealth Games gold, and famously finished 4th in the 400 metres final at the 1960 Rome Olympics. Electra Naismith looks back at his life.
Milkha Singh was one of India's most successful track and field athletes, and he was independent India's first sporting superstar. His exploits are legendary. He bagged 5 golds in international athletics championships and in 1959 won the Helms World Trophy for winning 77 of his 80 international races, a staggering feat. He also earned India its first ever Commonwealth gold at what was then the British Empire and Commonwealth Games in 1958.
Tobacco leads Salisbury into the home straight, and it's Brighton and Tobacco and Milkha Singh of India. Milkha Singh of India coming on the outside lane, and Spence coming through powerfully from the inside, and it's first Milkha Singh, second Spence South Africa, third Tobacco of Canada, fourth was Salisbury of England, fifth Brighton, and last McIsaac of Scotland.
In 1960, Singh missed out on what could have been India's greatest track and field medal, failing to win bronze at the Rome Olympics by just 0.1 of a second. It was agonising and taught a young fledgling nation what heartbreak felt like. But it was nothing compared to his own story. As a young boy in Multan province, he'd seen his parents and siblings brutally slaughtered during the horror of partition. His father's last words were "Bhag Milkha Bhag," run Milkha run, and he did, first to save his life and then to win medals. His inspirational story endeared him to millions. Ron Milka Ron became the title of a Bollywood film of his life in 2013. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi said he was anguished by Milka Singh's passing, but his struggles and strength of character will no doubt continue to inspire generations of young Indians.
Allegra Naismith. Still to come on this podcast. Why listening to Mozart could help people with epilepsy, and the Chinese artist who said he was telling the truth but was cancelled for misogyny. To Guinea now, where the World Health Organization has announced the end of the country's second Ebola outbreak, which was declared in February. The WHO has praised the West African country's response to the outbreak. Its regional director for Africa is Dr. Matshidiso Moeti.
This Ebola outbreak was the same place as the West African outbreak that killed 11,000 people. Thanks to new innovations, Guinea was able to contain the virus in just 4 months, preventing the disease from spreading beyond the country's borders.
Our Africa regional editor Will Ross told us more about how Guinea managed to break Ebola's hold.
Over the last 4 months, it's worked hard to try and stop this outbreak from spreading, and there were 12 lives lost. 11 patients, we understand, survived after being confirmed to have contracted the Ebola virus. But what the authorities are saying, and they really are celebrating the official end of this outbreak, is they managed to put in place across the country quite a lot of health centres, places where people could get close to those who were suspected of having Ebola and have frontline workers there. One of the other issues that changed this outbreak is really that there was an Ebola vaccine that was rolled out, and it was if they found a case of Ebola, say in a certain village, they would then vaccinate anybody they thought had potentially come into contact with that person, plus any frontline health workers there. So that helped to stop this from spreading.
On that basis then, will other countries in West Africa be able to learn lessons from this and potentially follow suit if and potentially when further Ebola cases are identified?
I think so. I think the lessons learnt from the terrible events of 2013 to 2016 mean that all countries will be a bit better positioned to try and tackle any outbreak. And the vaccine, we understand, should help, and the WHO managed to ship out about 24,000 doses. And the WHO is also saying that what's happened over the last 4 months in Guinea with the stopping of this outbreak is a lesson really in the need for there to be an equitable distribution of vaccines. And they're not just talking about Ebola, of course. WHO is talking about the fact that across most of the African continent, the vaccine for the coronavirus is not available at the moment.
That was the BBC's Will Ross. The World Health Organization's latest global alcohol action plan is being criticised across social media. The first draft of the plan seems to suggest there should be a prevention of drinking among pregnant women and women of childbearing age. Activists have condemned the draft as a threat to hard-won women's rights. Our reporter Stephanie Prentice told us more.
Across various social media platforms, women are outraged. The topic's been trending consistently for more than 24 hours. And what a lot of people are saying is asking women not to drink at all is sexist, it's prohibitive in terms of lifestyle, and it's just another way to control women's bodies and behaviour, as well as putting sole responsibility for fetal health on women who statistically abuse alcohol less than men. Now, British reproductive healthcare charity BPAS are one of many to come out with a statement on this, saying it's a step backwards for women's rights just generally. I spoke to their CEO, Claire Murphy, just before we came on air, and she told me why she found the wording very disturbing.
You're treating all women as effectively pre-pregnant. This is guidance which applies the world over, and we know that the world over that women's bodies, women's choices are often restricted, sometimes criminalised even. And language, as we see in this guidance, proposals that we see in this guidance absolutely feed into that suggestion that somehow women's choices and decisions, women's reproductive autonomy can be compromised.
So that view there has been echoed by many women's rights organisations around the world. But on the flip side, some experts have responded to that backlash. They're saying the report is only a draft. It's yet to be discussed at the upcoming WHO forum, and it is open to interpretation.
Stephanie Prentice. If you're afraid of needles but still waiting to get your COVID vaccine, there's some potentially good news for you. Researchers in Australia are starting clinical trials on a new type of coronavirus vaccine, which comes in the form of a nasal spray. The scientists at Brisbane's Nucleus Network believe this treatment could be more effective against the virus than the Pfizer and AstraZeneca jabs. From Sydney, here's Phil Mercer.
Hi, my name is Sakshi and I'm a doctor. Did you know that COVID-19 vaccines are free for everyone in Australia?
Despite concerted public health campaigns, the vaccination programme here has been slow compared to other countries. There have been supply problems, complaints about poor planning by the government, and with very few coronavirus cases, there's been complacency as well as hesitancy in the community. Australia is accelerating its inoculation rollout. In the future, there could be an easier way for vaccines to be administered with a nasal spray. It's designed to attack the virus as it enters the body.
It reproduces just once, but that should give us around 100 times more of that spike protein that the benign virus is delivering, and therefore a much stronger response, which is why, again, we hope it'll be able to work when we give it into people's noses.
Dr. Paul Griffin is the medical director at the Nucleus Network, a research organisation that's beginning trials of the nasal therapy. While other drugs mostly protect against developing severe symptoms of COVID-19, it aims to reduce the chances of infection.
The main benefits is when we give the vaccine via the same route that the pathogen or the virus gets in through, then hopefully the response will be more adept at actually stopping the virus getting in. So we'll get a response that's particularly active at that site, which will hopefully mean that people are much less likely to get infected, which is something that we really want to see with vaccines for this virus.
The Australian trial has been approved by an independent ethics committee. Researchers have said the nasal spray could be available in a year or two.
Phil Mercer. Music has a way of affecting our mood, and its impact on the brain has long fascinated scientists. Now, a study has found that listening to music by Mozart can actually reduce epileptic activity within the brain. But the researchers found that listening to a piece composed by Haydn caused it to increase, particularly among men. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes explains.
The effect on the brain of listening to Mozart's Sonata for Two Pianos has already been closely studied. For example, there's an idea that it helps you work better, but with inconclusive results. Now, a small Czech project involving 18 people with relatively severe epilepsy has produced some surprising results. Listening to a recording of the first movement of the 18th century composer's masterpiece reduced the electrical brainwaves associated with epilepsy by more than 30%. And researchers believe it was not so much the emotional impact of the music, but rather its acoustic properties, rhythm, dynamics and tone, that may have an effect on the electrical activity in the brain. The study also found differences in how men and women respond to music. When played Haydn's Symphony No. 94, epileptic brain activity in men actually increased. The research team say more work is needed, but suggest music could be a future therapy for some types of epilepsy, a condition that affects around 6 million people in Europe alone.
A touch of classical class on the Global News podcast. Now, an art gallery in the Chinese city of Shanghai has removed an exhibit that ranked images of women from prettiest to ugliest. The male artist behind the piece filmed women without their consent or their knowledge, as Charlotte Gallagher reports.
Uglier and Uglier is a 7-hour video artwork featuring 5,000 women who were filmed walking around a university campus. The artist behind it, Song Ta, ranked them by how attractive he thought they were. His team sorted them into forgivably ugly and unforgivably ugly before making the final decision. Defending his work, Song Ta said he had every right to, in his words, tell the truth. But unfortunately for him, many others didn't agree, calling it misogynistic and intrusive. One said on social media, "It's 2021. How can you still objectify women so boldly without any shame?" After the outcry, the OCAT Shanghai Gallery removed the exhibit and apologised, saying it disrespected women. There's anger that such a prestigious gallery had shown the piece without considering the impact. The artwork has drawn comparisons with the origins of Facebook, which was designed so students at Harvard University in the US could rate fellow students by how good-looking they were.
Charlotte Gallagher. Now, we'll end this podcast by switching from cancelled contemporary art to the mystery surrounding two valuable 17th century paintings dumped in a skip at the side of the road in Germany. Police have launched an investigation, but as yet no one has claimed the artworks. Mike Sanders reports.
The gilded frames alone would have made most people think twice, but someone dumped the paintings nevertheless in a motorway service area at Ohrenbach in central Germany. Art experts say they are originals. One, of an adolescent boy in a red cap, is by the Dutch artist Samuel van Hoogstraten, who studied under Rembrandt in Amsterdam. The other is a smirking self-portrait by the lesser-known Italian painter Pietro Bellotti. They were spotted by a 64-year-old man who handed them in to police.
That report by Mike Sanders. And that's all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast a little later on. If you want to comment on this one or anything we've covered within it, do send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. The producer was Farhana Darwood, the studio manager Joe Leeds, and the editor Karen Martin. I'm Gareth Barlow. Until next time, goodbye.
Can you help us to solve a case that's remained a mystery for over 50 years?
There are somebody living who knows more about this case.
With the help of our listeners, the Death in Ice Valley podcast has been trying to work out the identity of a woman found dead in a remote Norwegian valley.
Lots of these little facts were sort of coming together and seeming really interesting.
But after a lot of promising leads, we still don't have an answer.
I went everywhere I could.
So that's where we need your help. Someone still alive today must know who this woman was.
Your person's cover story was Alitalia stewardess, right? Which is a very glamorous job to have at that time, but it's also a great cover story.
All the background you need is in the podcast Death in Ice Valley from the BBC World Service and NRK.
I don't know if I'll be more disappointed when the story is finally resolved, because then there won't be anything else to figure out.
Search for Death in Ice Valley wherever you get your podcasts.